I am going to introduce our second panel on the case, or rather our moderator of our second panel, on the case of the extractives sector. And the moderator of the panel is Barbara Kafka, who serves as a senior advisor at the Partnership for Transparency. She's asked me to remind everyone that you can tweet at #transparency. We ran out of time in the first panel, but we will feed Barbara some questions from Twitter, from social media. There's #transparency up there for the town hall portion of this section. And there was a woman who wanted to ask the last question. I'll find her and make sure that Barbara calls on her for a question in the town hall as well. She was waiting very patiently. And Barbara served for over 33 years at the World Bank in a range of posts, which involved her in the economic and social development of countries across Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, and East and South Asia. She was also involved in World Bank corporate policy and strategy development and several bank-wide corporate committees. She is today a member of the board of directors of New Futures East Meets West Foundation. She holds a BA in economics from Duke and received an MBA from MIT's Sloan School. In addition, she studied at the Harvard World Bank Executive Development Program and at Georgetown. On a supplemental note, when I served as ambassador in Prague, U.S. ambassador in Prague, I lived in the house built by Barbara's grandfather. So we got to be friends long before we dreamed up this panel. We got to be friends because of that. And now I'd like to welcome Barbara and the rest of our distinguished panel members to the stage, and Barbara will introduce them all after they've been mic'd. Thank you, everyone.
Maybe while everybody is getting mic'd, I will just tell you who our panelists are. We have the only lady up here is Sheila Kama, who is a practice manager in the energy and extractives global practice at the World Bank. I actually met Sheila a couple of years ago while doing some work for the African Development Bank, where she was a director before coming here. We have Jeff Healy, the Chief External Affairs Officer of BHP Billiton, sitting next to Sheila. And on his right, we have Danny Kaufman, who was a longtime World Bank colleague and is now president and CEO of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. And immediately to my right, we have Ian Gary, Director of Accountable Development Finance in Oxfam America. So let me go sit over there and we can start. Thank you. I'm going to start with Sheila. You've heard this morning about the reference to the research projects that are now coming up in Brookings, R4D, World Bank, IFC, and you're probably wondering what they're all about and what they're going to contribute to what is already known out there. So let's kick off by letting Sheila tell us about the one of the World Bank and IFC, the World Bank Group.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you everyone for being here. The initiative that we at the World Bank and the IFC have the pleasure of being part of is called From Disclosure to Development. And this is an initiative that we are undertaking with our partners, BHP Billiton Foundation. So From Disclosure to Development essentially seeks to use data more effectively to ensure that extractive industries impact positively on the lives of people, but also more importantly that it contributes towards the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Disclosure to Development initiative essentially has three pillars. The first is essentially that we want to use data more effectively to inform dialogue. The second is that having disclosed data, we believe it's not sufficient just to put data there in the public domain, but that data must be broken down and analyzed so that it is much more user-friendly. So that would be the second leg of the data for the Disclosure to Development initiative. The third leg of the initiative deals essentially with dialogue and deliberation, which is to say, having gathered data, having analyzed it and made it user-friendly, then you put it out and ensure that you can facilitate people interested in the data to deliberate over the data, to dialogue, and then to say, based on this data, what do we know? How can it help us in the extractive industry move towards more sustainable development of the resources? So in a nutshell, that is the initiative, and I hope many of you here will stay with us today, because in the afternoon after lunch we break into smaller groups, and hopefully many of you can then contribute to helping us shape how we move forward with these pillars in order to make disclosure of data much more impactful. But that would be about it, Barbara.
Can you just tell us why you chose, the World Bank Group chose to focus on the extractive industries?
Well, for one, I suppose, speaking from my own perspective, I'm a miner, so mining and extraction comes naturally to me. But I suspect that the answer is much, of course, more broader than that. First of all, natural resources, minerals, oil and gas are finite. They are really nature's windfall. We get it right once or we get it wrong forever. And so naturally, from a development perspective, the intervention is very important in ensuring that the resources are used beneficially. But more importantly also, many of our member states are very well endowed with natural resources. And for many countries, natural resources are the gap between economic development and the lack thereof. But the important intervention is naturally how they are governed and how they are turned into benefits for citizens of those countries. And so is the recognition that in many countries, the development and the management of natural resources is a major challenge, that we saw it necessary to be part of this initiative.
Okay. So let me move now to Danny Kaufman. Danny, we've heard about the World Bank Group research. There's also another research that is going on with Brookings, the National Resource Governance Institute, R4D. Can you tell us about that and what it is aiming to accomplish and how it links with what the World Bank Group is doing?
Thanks, Barbara. And linking it to what Sheila and the World Bank just said, and to the earlier morning, let me, so not to have it too dry, let me link it to a couple of notions that were just mentioned. One is this estimate that I take some responsibility, the $1.5 trillion in bribery from around the world. Let's just make it very clear that that came through a methodology and a lot of measurement. This is from over 12 years ago, when I estimated within a range to be $1 trillion. But then we have been looking at the data very, very hard over the past 20 years. We have the Worldwide Governance Indicators. We'll release them in a few days for the update. And there is no compelling evidence, looking at all the data sets, that control of corruption has improved over the past 20 years, on average around the world. Of course, some countries have shown that it is possible to improve, and there are quite a few, and others have gone down, and then there's a middle. Unfortunately, one group of countries which not only has not improved, but slightly deteriorated over the period, are the resource-rich countries. So that links to Sheila's point and to your question also, why we are here today. On that basis, one can extrapolate the around estimate of $1 trillion of back then to now, but one has to use that with a lot of caution. The methodology and all the data was done 12 years ago. Let me also suggest that it's also very important to focus on other quantitative estimates of the cost of corruption, how a country that does address corruption in the long run increases its per capita income threefold, by 300%. We have done that work in the past. So let's not get stuck only with one bribery estimate. It's just bribery, which is $1 trillion plus dollar. Now, in terms of the Brookings project, where R4D and us in RGI are beginning to collaborate now, and let me make it very clear from Natural Resource Governance Institute's perspective, it's incredibly important, and I know for Brookings R4D too, that complete independence in terms of this project, and I know that significant amount of funding goes from the BHP to Brookings. We don't receive any of that funding, and we're totally independent, and so our partners. And it's absolutely critical that for any research project. Let me mention very quickly 3 key components on this project. One is applied research. Build a body of evidence to figure out which approaches and interventions have worked, do work, and which ones do not, and why. Particular focus in resource-rich countries for the reasons just mentioned. The focus is on transparency, but not just on transparency, accountability and participation. The issue of civic space that was brought up is absolutely crucial in the natural resource sector in resource-rich countries, as well as other complementary factors that are needed for success. Second, power of data. The power of data to address natural resource governance challenges in order to improve corruption control. So the whole issue of providing effective access, including with open data tools and dissemination of natural resource governance data for anti-corruption is very important. Last and certainly not least is partnerships. Partnering and supporting key stakeholders in the NGO, public and private domain at each stage. In framing already, that's why we're here today, in framing the evidence, the design, dissemination, drawing lessons. Let me very quickly mention 2 very important considerations in this context, because today is such an important event in the early stage of that. First is how to fight against, sorry for the expression, the da factor, okay? How to go beyond the obvious in transparency. We know that transparency is necessary but insufficient. A lot of work has been done on that. We know that civic space is crucial and needed as well. But what else is also key is critical. The issue of impunity, the role of state-owned enterprises, particularly oil, but also in the mining sector, responsibility of the private oil companies is crucial in that. Second and last consideration is how to achieve the critical aim in this very difficult field of both taking into account the context of each country. There's a context specific of each country and uniqueness on the one hand, while still aiming to draw some lessons which apply more broadly for a set of countries in this context. There's quite a bit emerging from EITI, from others, and our research, including our just released 2017 Resource Governance Index, where there are many important insights. I'm not going to get into that, but one of them is the major challenge of implementation, which we can discuss more later.
Thank you very much, Danny. I guess I was shocked, as some others of you might have been, to hear that there's no evidence that all of the work of the past 20 years has had any impact on reducing corruption. Did I get that right?
As on average globally, but there are dozens of countries that have increased, while many have gone in the wrong direction, and then many have muddled through. So we need to draw the lessons, and there are great examples. I come from Chile and Latin America. We have had our challenges, but we made progress. There are a number of countries in Latin America, there are a number of countries in Africa, the Botswanas of this world and others, that show, yes, it can be done. But let's face it, there are also the Venezuelas, there are the Azerbaijans and others that have gone in the other direction. So that there should be no major criticism to the field as a result, but it's a sobering reality compared with many other areas where there has been progress for the whole world. On average, that's not been the case according to the data in a significant manner here. But there are many countries, and what has happened in the Baltics and so on, that show, yes, it can be done, and improvement has taken place.
Okay, we may want to get back to some more discussion on that later. I want to turn to Ian Gary. You have mentioned in the past the term the transparency industrial complex, where you refer to actors, stakeholders, governments, international financial institutions just doing these things so that they can burnish their images and so forth. Tell us frankly, what do you think of these two research projects that you hear our colleagues talking about? Do you think this is another study in that same mode? What can they do to be constructive and make it a useful addition to what is out there, rather than just another piece of that complex?
Great, and thanks to Brookings and the other organizers of this event for having Oxfam on the panel. I think first I want to just explain what I mean by the transparency industrial complex. I think there's a plethora of initiatives that have been ignoring the political dimensions of the problems these transparency initiatives are trying to address, sometimes willfully ignoring those. And as Danny and others have said, since the late 90s, Oxfam, many other organizations in the Publish What You Pay coalition have been pushing for transparency with the clear notion that this is only a first step in addressing some of the problems of resource-rich countries. It's been a long struggle. So one of the points I want to make is that there have been obstacles and opposition all along the way to increasing transparency in the extractive industries. There have been companies such as ExxonMobil who've sued the US government to block transparency initiatives in the extractive industries. But at the same time, there has been real progress that's been made, including mandatory disclosure laws, new policies, for example, at the IFC requiring payment disclosure and contract disclosure. That said, the transparency agenda is far from finished. We need the contracts out. We need open contracting processes. We need beneficial owners disclosed to the public. There's a great deal of information that is not yet available. So I think one of the context points I want to make is that we shouldn't be sitting here saying that the transparency revolution is complete. Now we're trying to understand why the information is not having an effect. Yes, there is some information out there that's good, but we need more information. So there are significant political uses for transparency initiatives such as EITI, and we've seen in some cases where it's being used as a fig leaf to cover up bad behavior by companies or by governments. So for example, if you look at an IFC project document and they say, under governance, the country is implementing EITI, and that's basically the discussion of the governance context of the country, that's not sufficient. So we need to understand what those political dimensions are. And with the IMF, for example, the question I would have asked Madame Lagarde is around the kinds of loan programs they're making to countries in Central Africa like Gabon and Cameroon, where these are some of the most corrupt countries in the world. They're not using EITI to achieve the aims. In fact, some of those countries have arrested activists while serving on the EITI board. So there are definitely these political uses. And as Danny and others have mentioned, the growing restrictions on civil society organizations. So on the one hand, you have increased uptake of transparency initiatives, but on the other hand, new NGO laws. Just this weekend, the Washington Post reported that 60 activists in India have been killed since the right to information law has been passed. So we can't underestimate these kinds of issues and not look at the use case of data only in technical and capacity terms, but also in political terms. I think in terms of what these projects should do and not do, as Danny said, avoiding the duh factor, don't test questions that we already know the answers to. We know that transparency needs to be complemented by rule of law, civic space. We know that there are other key determinants, as the project talks about, that need to complement open governance. We need to look at how these projects will build on and not duplicate other initiatives, such as the Publish What You Pay Data Extractors Project. And we need to take a close look at the theory of change behind these projects, and I hope we have time to discuss the theory of change behind these projects. If we're looking at a 5-year project that will come out with recommendations, what is the theory of change in terms of how those recommendations will be taken up by governments? What happens when governments know the right thing to do and simply don't do the right thing? And how can these contribute? How do these projects contribute to that? What are the gender dimensions of these transparency initiatives? We should look at those questions. Oxfam has been doing some research on social accountability in the extractive industry, so looking at the gender dimensions in the fight against corruption. And then what are the complementary roles of formal and informal accountability mechanisms? I think this was mentioned in the first panel, but very little work done on actually increasing the sanctions against people who are doing corrupt acts. And then I think the final point I would want to make is these projects have as their unit of analysis the country context, but we should be very clear that these are multidimensional problems that go from the local to the global level. So looking at the role of international actors in facilitating corruption, looking at the role of the World Bank and the IFC and the IMF themselves in implementing their own policies, I think these are some of the issues that should be taken into account.
Thank you very much. Jeff Healy, your organization is what's making all this research possible. And one might ask, coming from business, why are you interested in this? Why do you want more research in this area? Cynics would say that business might have a different motivation. They'd like to get on with their work and be able to pay what bribes they need to pay to in order to get their contracts. So where are you coming from?
Sure, thanks, Barbara, and good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here and on this panel. You know, I think it's very easy to answer the question what the business case is. You've only got to look at the realities of being the largest natural resources company in the world and what that entails to understand how important transparency is. Now, quite simply, for a company like ours, public acceptance and trust is at the forefront. And if I can just give a concrete example about that, a few weeks ago now, my company committed another $2.5 billion to the extension of a copper mine in northern Chile, a mine that's been around for 12 years or so now, and that commitment of $2.5 billion will preserve that mine for another 50 years. And what goes along with that is a desal plant, power plants, water lines. So to be very clear, when we turn up at a place like that, we invest ourselves in the middle of that community for decades to come. And you can't just say sort of somewhere along the line, look, it isn't really working out here, so I'm just going to pack up and move on. It doesn't work that way. So, you know, our operation really does depend upon winning and maintaining trust with our communities. And it's trust that will behave ethically, and it's trust that will, you know, hand to the communities around us a fair share of the value that we create. So I talk in terms of trust, but the best way we believe to build trust is through transparency. And when you look at the lack of trust in corporates over the last decade or so, transparency becomes even more to the core. And I don't just mean, you know, putting data up, because while that's helpful and that's a proof point, what really matters when you put the data up is that you really have accountability to make what underlies that work properly, and we get held to account, and the more we put forward as well, the more governments will be held to account. So I guess, Barbara, the answer is it's not a nice to have for BHP, it's an absolute imperative to our business. And I would just underline the fact that this isn't window dressing for us, just to give you a couple of examples of what we've done in this area. We were a founding member of EITI back in 2002. We're the first extractive company to come out and report project by project the revenues that we provide into government. And our next report, it's our third, will be released on Wednesday. We do disclose beneficial ownership information, particularly in the wake of Panama. That's critical, where we have, fortunately now, a very few number of entities in our structure that operate in low tax jurisdictions. We publish when they were incorporated, what their purpose is, and what we're doing about trying to bring those arrangements to an end. And I guess finally, Barbara, I'd say that the work of the foundation, which we're very pleased to be here playing a part in today, also shows that the foundation puts its money where the collective BHP mouth is on this. We have deliberately, through the foundation, set up to look at the whole natural resources value chain, from arrival at the exploration stage through to the sale of our commodities. And it is through that emphasis that we come to where we are today. There already is a project up and running with Transparency International on the very front end of the value chain, the issuing of mining licenses and permits, with the very sensible rationale that if you don't get that front end of the value chain right, then you're likely to have problems all the way through the value chain. And I'm sure as we go on a little further in the panel, we'll talk about the importance of the two projects that we are delighted to have a part in supporting. And if I could just say that in relation to data, such a critical project, I think so much great work has been done by people in this room, a transformational change on information from a decade ago. And I see that project really building on and taking to the next level this very important part of capturing data in a meaningful way, as we talk about it at BHP, purposeful transparency. That's what we're all looking for. And the work that Brookings are leading to ask and I think answer the difficult question, what's all this work led to for the citizens in resource-rich countries? It's really going to be a fascinating piece of work, and something I'm sure, again, building on the work that's been done and talking about the coalition of all the different interests here, will lead to some strong outcomes, which we're all looking forward to.
Thank you. Do you have an immediate question of clarification, or? Okay, we'll do another brief round of questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. Sheila, I'm going to go back to you a minute to ask you about data and what you're trying to achieve in this project. There's tons of data out there these days. 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. But there's a plethora of data. There's a plethora of information. People are kind of overwhelmed by it. What are you expecting to do we understand that the data hasn't been used the way people had expected, and that the data perhaps is not the right data, I don't know. But can you explore a little bit more what the data issue is and what your project hopes to accomplish?
Yeah. So it is true that there's a lot of data out in the world, but several factors I think are very important when we think about the subject of data. First of all is data access. Just a lot of the people that are affected by the extractive industries are not in the group that has access to data. Part of what we hope to achieve is to balance that information asymmetry, to make sure that the data reaches those that need it most, I think is the first thing. The second thing also is that data per se, as indeed transparency, is not a panacea. We think that there are many other aspects of data. That is why we have the three aspects of the projects, which is not just disclosure, but also dialogue around that data. What we hope to be able to encourage those interested in sustainable development of resources to understand better, once they have the data, what is the data telling us? How can we use this data to trigger a behavioral change on the part not just of politicians, but of the citizens themselves? But also, we hope to be able to use that to empower those who need to dialogue with the leadership with concrete, verifiable facts that can encounter the often pushback from politicians. So we think that it's not enough just to have the data, but also data needs to be current. True, there is data, but some of the data, I may say, is outdated. And so the data itself needs to continuously be made current and relevant to the prevailing challenges. And so part of what the project seeks to do is not just to disclose, but to also ensure currency. But more importantly, to serve as a trigger mechanism for behavioral change, particularly in the policy space, particularly in the development space, but also particularly in the space of investors themselves and how they interact with communities and create a near level playing field. This is what we are trying to achieve.
Thank you. Danny, if I could turn to you now. You mentioned before that in resource-rich countries, performance on corruption has deteriorated. We have this EITI initiative, which was introduced with great fanfare, 10 years ago or so. Why hasn't it solved the problem? What's happened, and what can we do about it?
Okay. First, about that type of work. The deterioration over the past 20 years has been mild, and it's again on average, and I will discuss that in a second. There are at least two very distinct groups there. Second, let's keep in mind EITI, and I'm not totally neutral for full disclosure. I'm a member of the International Board. There are key executives from the Secretariat here that would attest that I'm continuously pushing there. So we want to improve, and improvements are always needed. But EITI just starts with a conference in 2003. It's not until 2009 that the first set of rules become subject to implementation by the country, and only for payment transparency very narrowly. That evolves to 2011, a new set of rules. It barely broadens. It's by 2013, it starts expanding its scope to other dimensions of transparency, and it has recently been revised to be the new standard in 2016. So that's important to get into those details, because in terms of research design, to try and see what has happened from 2003 to 2011, that's not going to lead to results. And that's why it's so important, the issue of the research design and timing. Key new innovations of EITI that only come recently, and that's where the metal is going to be tested in terms of research and findings in coming years, including on the impact on anti-corruption. In addition to payment transparency about revenues, within that, there is now the commitment to more granularity project by project, and that's in response. And that's a great achievement that we had in EITI in response to the major disappointment by US Congress having vacated the rule for now of Dodd-Frank 1504. Now, 52 countries have to be committed to do so, but that's within a time frame. That's payment transparency. That's basically how much. But then there's also the what. How much should have been the receipt? That's contract transparency. That's now also in the standard. It's not as obligatory as should be. That's for the future. And third dimension of this key troika is the who, and that's beneficiary ownership that you mentioned. This is all recently adopted in 2016. It's adopted beneficiary ownership, but to be implemented in coming years. So again, it's a question of research design. One could not have expected significant impact by then. Crucially, complementing the transparency, and thanks to our partners and our push, we introduce a protocol to protect civil society, because transparency alone, as you were saying before, it's not going to deliver the goods. It has to be matched with civic space and accountability. So now, and this is recent, there are safeguards, which if a country doesn't meet it, out. Azerbaijan is out. A country doesn't meet it in applying it, it cannot come in, regarding protecting civic space. It's absolutely crucial. That's also very recent. So we have to introduce that in terms of the project design into the future. Data, the results are showing now. I've been looking very closely, but it's still emerging research regarding what has happened over the past few years. And a very interesting initial finding emerges. There are two sets of countries. The old-timers who came to EITI in the early days, when it was much more lenient and much more narrow, they are not doing better on anti-corruption. To the contrary, they're doing worse. Versus the newcomers, the ones that have come more recently, both in terms of voice and democratic accountability, civic space, and in terms of anti-corruption, they're doing better. One has to get into the devil in the details and start looking to that instead of just looking at averages.
Hey, thank you. Ian, were you around for the first panel?
I was.
You were. Okay, so you heard the discussion around the role of civil society, and maybe it's getting short shrift or not getting enough attention in this whole in this whole work. And I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit, on civil society's role in ensuring that corruption efforts or anti-corruption efforts have an impact, and what you think has been deficient until now, and what you would like to see done in the context of these projects to make sure that civil society is taken adequately into account.
Well, I think as Danny has said, there has been a divorce between transparency initiatives and human rights initiatives. And in fact, I've been told by people that EITI is not a human rights initiative. It's a transparency initiative. I don't know how you can separate the two. And when you have at the country level a multi-stakeholder working group, including civil society, governments, and companies, and when members of that stakeholder group from civil society are arrested, harassed, or intimidated, there's no way that you can see the spillover effects that people want to see from transparency in that country. At the same time, in a country like Equatorial Guinea, where there is no real independent civil society, it's hard to believe that EITI can make an impact. And the IMF right now is considering whether or not to bail out Equatorial Guinea because they're in a financial crisis as a result of the oil price slump. So there are real issues about how civil society has the space or doesn't have the space to participate. Where they do have the space, and I think this is a very important point that I want to emphasize, data is being used, and it's being used to have impact. So we should not start this conversation by saying a lot of effort has been put into data disclosure and it's not being used, because that's simply not true. I've been in Ghana and Zambia over the last couple of months. I've seen plenty of examples of where data is being used. For example, in Ghana, civil society groups are taking the disclosures from petroleum revenues, following it through the national budget, and then tracking individual projects and doing value for money audits that involve local citizens. So that's happening on the ground. The same thing in Zambia. And I think the reason why Danny has emphasized project level reporting is that these transparency and anti-corruption conversations really need to start at the grassroots level and work their way up. So I think part of the problem we've had is that the conversation stays in a very elite and relatively close circle of discussion between civil society, companies, and governments in the national capitals, but doesn't reach all the way down. So in Zambia, there are project-level disclosures being made as a result of EITI and mandatory disclosure laws, and citizens at the local level are tracking how much money their local government is receiving and asking questions of their local government. So that happens in places where people have the space to do it, but I think one of the things that these projects need to really grapple with is how the results of the projects will have an impact in where civil society space is constrained or non-existent.
Okay. Jeff, what advice from a corporate perspective would you have for these research projects? What do you think it is important to tackle? What's the biggest challenge? What would the corporate sector most benefit from?
Sure. I'm not sure I would sort of purport to offer advice about this to this room who've worked with these issues for a long time, but I would just make maybe 3 observations about things that I think need to underpin open governance initiatives for them to have real bite. And the first of those, I would say, is around accountability, that open governance and transparency are just a means to an end. So when we look at it from a BHP perspective, and I said at the beginning how important it is for us to work with our communities, what's really important to us is that there's not value leakage out to places it shouldn't go. And while I completely understand and fully support the importance of what we're doing, in the end we all have to be accountable. That's the corporate sector, government, and civil society for outcomes as soon as we can. The second thing I would say is there shouldn't be any free riders in open governance. And I look at that a few different ways. I hear SMEs quite often say it's too hard to do this. And I really don't believe that. It's hard to put in tax returns as well. So, yes, we're a big company and we do what has to be done, but I don't accept this line that there should be free riders. I'm an SME, I can't do it. I also look at the absence of SOE reporting, and that has to change. I look at the way host governments report through EITI, and there's some terrific material there, but both Danny and Ian have referred to the relative paucity at the moment of project by project, so there's very high level reporting. We do report project by project, and when you start to get granular, it starts to become a lot more useful. And I'd also say donor governments need to... I've had this discussion with donor governments, and I understand the complexity, but there are times at which donor governments can use their muscle a little bit more, in my view, as well. And look, the third thing I'd say is that to make this successful, and Madame Lagarde mentioned this, everyone has to work together. There's a lot of people in the extractive area taking different parts of the value chain, and bringing that effort together is going to be critical to it working. And I look at the work on data, and I talked about it being purposeful transparency. That is what we're after, but that requires a huge amount of work with the plethora that we have of compulsory and voluntary standards. Just pulling that together and giving it some more consistency and some more purposefulness is going to be a significant task. And finally, with the Brookings work, I see the potential for a deep reservoir of information coming through that, but it has to have buy-in, it has to be open, and it has to be inclusive of all actors, and it has to end up being very practical in what it produces. So for me, it's really those 3 things. It's accountability, it's no free riders, and it's about working together.
Sheila, did I see a little finger waving here?
You did.
Thank you, Jeff.
That's a worry.
No, as a matter of fact, because in the World Bank, our primary clients are nation states, the role of state-owned entities in the extractives is crucial. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a very important part of the landscape. If you think about many of the developing countries, not only are they resource rich, but as a matter of fact, the governments in those countries are, in many cases, the largest investors, and the driver of that investment is typically either oil, mineral, or gas. And therefore, the importance of this data extending to state-owned entities is vital in many countries, especially if we are going to not only empower the citizens, but also ensure that the value of the resources reach those that need them most. If we don't touch that landscape, you spoke of Zambia. Zambia's largest investor is ZCCMIH. Chile is Codelco. Angola is Sonangol. The world is just full of these entities in which the state has interest. And my sense is that when states regulate, somehow they are blindsided to regulating their own entities, that the regulatory and oversight should rest only with privately held entities. In my view, we won't be able to achieve what we wish, we aspire to, unless we somehow break that wall. That's the small finger.
Okay.
Look out for the big one.
Okay, before I move to the audience, does anybody else on the panel want to say something about what anybody else has said? Any burning reactions? Is that a finger? No.
There's a big finger.
Okay, let us move to the audience. There's a gentleman over there who had his hand up a while ago, so I'd like to give him the chance. And same rules as Norm indicated earlier. No question is too tough or off limits, so ask anything you want.
Thank
Or
you, panel.
politically
Mark
incorrect.
Robinson, World Resources Institute. Danny, you gave us a very helpful but sobering assessment of the evidence, showing very little has changed at the global level. But you also talked about some bright spots, countries that have made a real difference. In your knowledge of the evidence, what is the critical mix of factors you would identify in explaining those bright spots? How much does high-level political commitment make a difference, the point from Ian, as opposed to civil society initiatives, having the right institutions, an active private sector? What's the mix that is most commonly seen in those successful initiatives? And secondly, how do you respond to Ian's critique of the limitations of some of these global transparency initiatives? Are they limited, or are they part of a wider set of factors that help explain success? Thank you.
Yeah.
That's all? Well, this, I forgot to mention, this is a 5-year project, or 2 5-year projects I had, and that's the reason. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I have the answer to all your very good questions. So I'll just offer a very quick reflections, and again point to the absolute paramount importance of data and evidence. First, we know enough, and that has been said, to know that it's never one single factor, but it's a combination of factors. And one thing we are hoping in the next stage, this research and other research, is to try to understand better what is the interaction, the confluence of which 2, 3 key factors, which may vary from country to country, but more from types of country to country, which are important. Obviously, transparency is key, and that quite a bit of data is there. Obviously, the whole issue of civic space and accountability is also key, and so is political will. Let me just suggest that we need to go to the next stage in terms of the whole notion of political will. What does it mean in very heterogeneous political systems? In natural resource governance, there are great examples just when one leader in one type of key organization was there and had the wherewithal, had the power to do things, a lot of things would happen. While if somebody else was there, would not have happened, and there may have been political will or not at the very national level. A lot of that is happening at the subnational level. So we need to consider those factors very, very much. It was mentioned before, in terms of the absolute paramount importance of data. We need to focus more on something really boring, and that is the challenge of implementation. One of the key findings of the just released Natural Resource Governance Index is that quite a bit of progress has been made in adopting laws, regulations, and related regarding transparency. But as Ian mentioned earlier, the homework of implementation and making it all also go to at the subnational level and so on is enormously lacking. And that's not spread uniformly across the world. There are many countries where the implementation gap is enormous, others less so, and they are doing better. One key correlate with the challenge of implementation, which we need to understand better, and how to get it to impact. And then one key correlate is the extent of corruption and informality in the country. So we will need to relate those two things. At the end of the day, a lot is context specific, obviously, and it will vary from one set of countries to the other, but that some generalizations should be possible. Otherwise, we will be much hamstrung in this type of research project.
Okay, other questions? I see a hand way back. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much. My name is Faith Nwadishi, and I'm from Nigeria. I sat through the first panel and the second panel, but I have a concern. And that concern had been partially raised by Ernst's contribution about the involvement of the people at the grassroots, the people who live within communities where actual extraction is happening. And I want to link that up with global initiatives and policies that developing countries like my country fall over themselves to endorse and try to implement without really understanding the dynamics of the culture of the people and how to integrate that into that implementation. I find that as a key challenge in implementing a lot of these global policies that we have, because countries want to look good in the face of the global community. They go ahead to sign on to initiatives. Take, for instance, in Africa, we have the very wonderful African mining vision. And countries are not pushing as hard as they are pushing to implement the EITI, the OGP, as hard as that to implement the African mining vision. So my question is, this research, how will it take into consideration peculiar things within countries to ensure that in implementing or moving from disclosure to development, or ensuring that we have sustainable transparency and accountability, moving to progress, the peculiarities of countries are brought to bear. In some countries, you have specific laws that they're also not implementing. With that, will those kind of laws be assessed or analyzed to see how they can support countries in doing that? And finally, how is the research going to capture the voices of people who live within extractive communities, who are the ones that are supposed to benefit, so to say, from the revenues or the resources of extraction within their countries? How will their voices be captured without just looking at it from a national level, and we are not going to the grassroots to get the people's concern to ensure that we have a holistic response to the entire questions we're trying to answer here today? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Faith. Sheila, I'm going to turn to you to respond to that, how to integrate the particularities of country culture, hear the voice of the people. What is planned in the research for that?
So I think the question that Faith asks and the problem that she recognizes is a very real one. Because, of course, we are sitting here in Washington, but contemplating solutions for up to 60 countries in Africa. And if you went to on a project-by-project basis, that number would just increase tremendously. So I think we have to recognize that initiatives such as Disclosure to Development cannot be the entire solution, but only a contribution to the bigger picture. And our contribution is quite clear, is that to provide the data, and then to ensure that data is analyzed and packaged in a way that those grassroots communities can then discern the necessary and relevant information for themselves. The third pillar that I spoke of is the importance of then using that data to deliberate. So hopefully, with this data, the communities where the extraction is taking place have the capability to bring forward evidence to engage their governments. Certainly where we are limited is that we can't, and this is not the object of this project, though we recognize its importance. What we don't, through this project, aspire to do is to be an interface between those communities and the authorities. But that's not to say we don't recognize the importance of it. That's just to admit the limitations of what this project is intended to achieve. But Faith is absolutely correct that there is often a gap between the information reaching the people on the ground, but also breaking down the cultural barriers that sometimes get in the way of implementation. This is an important aspect, but sadly it's not one that is within the scope of this project.
Okay. Danny, you want to speak from your side of the research?
Yes, absolutely critical what Faith said. Again, for full disclosure, Faith is with us also as member of the civil society. We are in the EITI. Crucial question. A critical aspect of this research project, as far as I'm concerned, any such research project, is the country focus and country selection, and already some work has been ongoing in initially selecting a set of dozen or so countries as initial candidates where there would be research analysis and work is absolutely key. Within such countries, to go to that point, it's going to be crucial the choice of local partners to work with in this type of work, and also drilling down at the subnational level. Again, here the link, let me mention again the link with EITI. Many of these countries to be selected, because they are natural resource rich and the issues around it, are members of EITI. And EITI, with all its issues and faults, two of the great innovations there, and it was discussed in the morning, is addressing the challenge of voice, because it's tripartite, it's really a multi-stakeholder initiative in the way that IFIs are not there yet, for obvious reasons of governance. So civil society has equal voice to industry and to government, and that's not just at the general international Oslo level or something like that. That's at the national level with basically the national multi-stakeholder groups, and that's an area of collaboration as well as going beyond in terms of all the work that is done with other stakeholders at the country level, where, as Ian said earlier, a lot is already happening in terms of the use of data, but also in terms of this multi-stakeholder group and civil society being very active on those countries. That has to be leveraged here. And let me mention, we have not discussed this fully, because a lot about the project design is what we're starting today here, is the notion of surveying civil society, engaging them in the whole data gathering and feedback process at the subnational and national level, something that we have done a lot in the past for all kinds of indicators, including governance indicators and others. So the feedback to be gathered and then retroactively feeding back and having this consultation is going to be critical in the data gathering process itself, as far as I'm concerned, but that's the type of thing which still need to have much more discussions, and for which we're gathering here today.
Thank you. Okay, I'll do one from this side of the room. Twitter questions. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Yadaira Orsini, and I work for International Alert. I was just wondering whether the research is also going to take into account the different types of the challenges and opportunities of natural resource governance in places that are affected by conflict or are going through transitions to democracy. And I wouldn't dismiss the question that was made at the beginning by our colleague from Transparency, because I think it is a critical issue to look at. And especially because these countries will rely on natural resources for their survival in many cases and sustainability. And there are many opportunities related to regulatory changes, the political economy of things, the interests of many people, as well as the political will, which are the issues that are going to be at the forefront. So I would just like to know if this is being considered or could be considered. I'm sure quite a few of the countries in your list are already affected by conflict or have been. So it would be interesting to consider that as an additional variable and what that means in terms of transparency and effectiveness on that.
Quick answer from Sheila and Danny. Do you cover countries in conflict and transition?
Yeah, so as we said earlier, the reason we are gathered here today is so you can give us those ideas of where you think and what the approach should be. But certainly, we recognize that there has historically been a correlation, not always causal, between fragility and availability of resources. And so this is most likely an issue that warrants a distinct focus. The real question is, what data already exists on this matter? How can we use that data? And if it doesn't exist, how do we gather it and break it down to the level that it can have relevance in terms of what we try to achieve? But, by all means ask questions, but by all means also join us this afternoon to put forward aspects of what you think this project should cover.
Danny, quickly,
very,
and then
very
Ian.
quickly to echo that. At this stage, initial stage, nothing is off the table, and that's great, great feedback. And I know that in earlier suggestions, discussions, and so on, and you mentioned it, the countries like Chile are mentioned. I'm from Chile. I would be delighted that the project looks at Chile from that standpoint, but it cannot be at the expense of looking at a really tough case. So Chile is a good case, by the way, of a relative success story. So we need those two. And you mentioned Codelco earlier. Let me say that with some pride, and it was totally independent data analysis, Codelco comes out as the best state-owned enterprise rated in the index. So there are great stories too, as opposed to many others in the other extreme. So we cannot avoid looking at the tougher cases with conflict. Before there was discussion about kleptocracy, there is all issue of totally captured type of systems by the corporates. It's not just kleptocracy on the top. So it has to basically cover basically the whole spectrum to be able to draw lessons, particularly for the tougher cases that have not been making progress.
Ian?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment in terms of conflict and the issues that we're talking about here. I think if we put up the natural resource value chain on the screen behind us, the first chevron in that value chain would probably say the licensing process. But Oxfam believes that there should be a step before that, which is the decision about whether or not to extract in the first place. And so within the context of conflict-ridden countries, I think that's an extremely important question. But in many of the countries we're talking about, that decision is made without any consultation or without the consent of the population near the mine or the oil project. And Oxfam believes that that consent is a right for indigenous peoples and a principle that should be upheld for any project-affected community. Right now, there's an issue in Peru with Block 192 and the consultation law not being followed there. I don't think we want to be in a position where we're talking about transparency and use of revenues from projects where people don't want those projects anyways. And so I think we should just keep that in mind in terms of how we deal with conflict as related to the transparency issues we're discussing.
Okay.
Very quick, to help Ian, since we don't have a slide. This is the Natural Resource Charter that we produced some years ago, second edition. This is the whole value chain. Not only the first stage in the technical aspect is the discovery and decision to extract, but prior to that, and that's the blue part, one has to look at the governance foundations and the transparency, accountability, and the corruption issues that we're looking about are absolutely crucial part of an integrated chain. But that decision to extract is critical, as well as the whole issue of civil society space and participation.
Sheila, you have a
Yes.
intervention.
So again, I think the point that is raised about whether to or not to extract is a very important one. I mean, it has, first of all, development dimensions, but I think Jeff can say that from an industry perspective, it actually has a resource implication, because certainly in the mining industry, that question typically arises post-discovery, which is to say by then companies have invested money. It's not a statement on my part on whether or not it should be asked. It is just to recognize that data on understanding the investment necessary to get to that stage is essential, because by definition, you could say a state that licenses while reserving the right to afford their license or not is negotiating, quote unquote, in bad faith, because by definition you are investing money in order to recoup. So the real question from a policy perspective would be, in the event that we take the view that once discovered we must now take a step back, how do we deal with that, if you wish, sunken investment? I think it's one of the things we have to understand better, so that both from a government, a civil society, a community, and a government perspective, there is some kind of balance. I want to say, too, the point that you raised about indigenous communities, et cetera, again, an important question which I hope we can discuss in the afternoon is, whose resources are these anyway? Because now we speak almost as if that answer is self-evident, and yet the truth of the matter is increasingly it is not so obvious. We started off with a point of departure that assumed the state is custodian and that the people own. But then which people? Is it the indigenous, or is it the elite, and who else? This is another very important question, which I think is increasingly making exploitation of resources difficult, because even the sheer notion of who owns, who negotiates, who has the right, is a question that is increasingly becoming less clear. And so if we have any data on that that can support any policy direction, if we can discuss this in the afternoon to say, how do we deal with this data? How do we break it down to help governments make these policy decisions? My sense is that that might help us, especially in the fragility space, because it is failure to answer these questions that invariably leads to the crack, and it is that crack that often leads to fragility.
Thank you. I understand from Norm we have a few Twitter questions, so go for it.
We do. The question is on the World Bank. I'll give two. World Bank project and the IFC. It would be helpful to have more specificity regarding what data to be used by whom, how, and to what end. And then, Danny, a question to you, and of course these are also welcome for reflection by the entire panel. In the Brookings R4D NRGI project, it's all right, a microphone is not needed with me, even for those on the internet. Just open the window. On the Brookings R4D NRGI project, is it improving the data and the evidence, or working out how it can be used to shift the political and other contextual dynamics, the priority for your research agenda?
That should be my answer. No?
It's amazing what you can get into 140 characters, isn't it?
Okay, Sheila and Danny, over to you.
Okay, so again, this is work in progress. We sort of know where we want to end. What is lacking is exactly what is being asked, how to get there. We want to be able to have data that defines roles and responsibilities, but defines them in a way that creates an environment of decision-making that supports sustainable development. That's a mouthful. But in a nutshell, to say, at this stage, the reason we are gathered is to answer exactly those questions. What would be the most useful form of data? And once we have this data, what would we use it for and why? And some people have already suggested that we should focus in the space of fragility. Some people have suggested we should focus on grassroots communities. This afternoon's debate will hopefully afford us an equilibrium that will enable us to be more precise. But certainly the goal is to ensure sustainable development and equitable distribution of the benefits.
You want to make a two-hander?
Yeah, can I just add to that and
Yes.
just say, as a party interested in that project, and as Sheila says, the sort of how will work itself out, but in terms of the what we would really want to see through this work that the World Bank is doing is how you end up empowering the citizens of the communities that we work with to interrogate the data. Now, there's a massive amount of power out there on social media, and it's about getting the format's right, the consistency right, the searchability right, and then we want to see it become sort of unleashed to people to then pull it apart. And that will create the accountability. So I guess we can put in different ways what we want it to look like. From our point of view, we want it to be very practically capable of being analysed and pulled apart and pressured, really, to create the accountability.
Yeah.
Okay, Ian wants to intervene quickly before you.
Absolutely, Ian.
Well, I think I want to make the point that while the World Bank and BHP have a role in implementing these projects and supporting these projects, it's important to understand that they also have a role in increasing the availability of data themselves. And so I wouldn't want to see these research projects, for example, at the World Bank, delinked from the World Bank's own policies and practices and programs. So what I mean in a specific case is the World Bank is providing a lot of technical assistance to countries around extractive industries. That assistance provides them with some leverage. So for example, in Kenya, they're spending $50 million through a project to increase the capacity of the Kenyan government to manage the new oil sector. At the same time, they have not required Kenya to disclose any of their contractual arrangements with the oil companies operating in Kenya. The IFC is financing the leading oil project through Africa Oil, but has not implemented its contract disclosure requirements, so the contract is not available. We would like to see BHP adopt a policy of encouraging all of their contracts to be disclosed, all of the relevant agreements for those projects, because starting just from the basis of what we have available right now and the payment disclosures are not going to make a lot of sense if you don't have access to the fiscal terms. I could provide other examples, but I think I just wanted to make that point, to not separate the leverage that these institutions have from these specific projects that are being implemented.
And I think just through Ian's comments, we're seeing the importance of civil society in emphasizing things and holding the others to account. So this was an example in the flesh. Danny, I interrupted you twice.
You didn't interrupt me, and Ian already went a long way to give the answer that we hope we will also be pushing for. Look, there are two issues. One is in terms of what's a framework. At the end of the day, one wants to affect change at the local level. It was said already in the morning. We'd be pretentious to say that a research project or project from here, even with many partners there, it's going to do it on its own. Ultimately, it's the power of data, the power of evidence, of research insights and of findings, and empowering civil society and other stakeholders also, including industry and reformers in government, that can make the difference. And there are innovations in how to get open data is one, open data tools, but there are also innovations of how to get all these disparate data sets, which need to be put together. So improving the data is very, very important. But then in terms of the dissemination and working on the ground with the key stakeholders so that they are empowered, in particular civil society, to affect change is what's going to be critical here. There are great other case studies in Tanzania when finally some data was disclosed, thanks to EITI and others, including ourselves working on that. At the subnational level, they discovered that they were not getting essentially the transfers that they were due from the resources, and then that led to changes. And there are many cases like that. That is a key aspect of that, and recognizing then that data is not just a technocratic tool, but the power of data empowers civil society, which increasingly is using that. Let me just suggest at the same time that we need to be also very realistic, and we are learned from the lessons. It's not just a question of making the data available to any civil society group. There are intermediaries, there are the choice of partners and who one works with and how our type of NGOs and think tanks work, and including in terms of twinning and mentoring with those groups so that that data use becomes much more effective. I know Oxfam has also done that. It's absolutely critical. So the answer is obviously we want to do both, but we need to be mindful that at the end of the day are the citizens themselves and the key leaders from other organizations that are going to make it happen on the ground.
Thank you. Norm, how much time do we have left?
15.
13 minutes left.
13 minutes. Okay, we have time for several more questions. So this side of the room gets one, and the gentleman from the way back has had his hand up for a while.
Thank you very much. I'm Robert Thomas, and I'm an anti-corruption reporter. This is a question primarily for Mr. Healy, and it does relate to the contract level disclosure question. There's a lot of pushback in the business community around this issue. You've already spoken to the free rider problem, but I wanted to take a step further and ask you about the resistance based on proprietary information. Could you respond to that? Because a lot of what's being disclosed is payment to public entities. So that's public data. But I'd like you to discuss a little bit the contract level disclosure. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a good challenge to. I've said, I think, up front what we've done in relation to transparency now over a 20-year period, and we do in our, as you probably know, in what we call our taxes paid report, we do disclose all of the payments, whether they're contract bonuses, whether or not they're taxes, down to the project by project level. So there's a lot of information. You'll see our next version coming out in a couple of days' time. So I think when you get to the financial terms, they are there. You will see all of the payments. We call it an economic contribution and payments to governments report. So it's extremely wide. We are also, as I just mentioned briefly, we are doing a piece of work. The foundation is sponsoring a piece of work with Transparency International to look at the front end of the value chain, to look at the licenses and look at the permits and look at what anti-corruption controls need to go around that. So that work is now, I think, about a year in, the end of the first phase, and clearly we'll take a look at that and see what extra things could we be doing. Now, I think we have led the way in the industry, and we will keep trying to lead the way in the industry. When it comes to proprietary terms, there are two sides to these contracts. So we need to work through that. EITI and their standard, and Danny mentioned this before, is calling for this disclosure as well, and I think, as Danny put it, with a little more discretion at this stage, no doubt moving to a more aggressive approach over time as the standard has. So I guess I say, it's a fair question, it's a fair challenge. We put a lot of information out there. We'll let the TI work take its form, and we'll see whether we need to do more.
I think Danny has...
This is a very important point. And given the enlightenment that BHP has shown on the payment, and very granular one on that, let me push for the sake of discussion, because it's just so important, the contract transparency. We're not fully there yet. It's very much encouraging EITI, but not mandatory requirement. However, we did that, our colleagues in RNGI did the homework. We have found out that the majority of EITI implementing countries, namely about 27, are at least partially, if not fully, those countries already implementing contract transparency. That also goes to show that in this type of dynamics, countries and enlightened governments and with civil society are prepared just to move forward. So there is already a major movement afoot in knowing and releasing contracts. Your colleague in the foundation, James Ensor, is a great colleague of us in EITI. We need the support and the help in civil society and also in governments to push for that. It's a no-brainer. It has to be a requirement. And the same will apply next, and Eddie Rich is here from EITI, regarding environmental disclosures and so on. So rather than just looking what happened 6 years ago and was EITI making enough progress when it was just getting started, we are all in this together, and we need the collaboration, which is the multi-sector initiative of industry at some point saying enough is enough, let's cross the Rubicon. It's a no-brainer in 2017 to have full disclosure, so I appreciate that question about contracts. On beneficial ownership, it's already there. We need to make more progress on SOEs, as was said, and also regarding oil traders. That is still already in the new standard, but it's still pending the challenge of many oil traders which don't fully disclose. So it's not only about contracts, but the contracts issue is the opposition of some members of industry, just like some members of U.S. big oil are still opposed to project by project, as we all know in Dodd-Frank. At some point, we have to say collectively, not just civil society, it's enough. We are in the 21st century of transparency.
Jeff, any response to this?
No. I think it's very fair, and I think we're doing a lot in this area, and many of our contracts are public. They're public in Western Australia, for example, where state agreements govern the way we mine in that state. And I think Danny's call is a little broader, which is doing what we can do, but also playing our part in advocacy here. And it is the next stage, and there are many good reasons why it should happen.
Ian, you wanted to intervene.
Yeah, just on the question of contract disclosure and proprietary information. I think when we're talking about disclosure of an agreement between a government and a company where they are disposing of an asset that's owned by the people and managed on behalf of the government, that information has to be disclosed. And I would say that the fiscal terms do not constitute proprietary information, and rarely, if ever, is there real proprietary information in these contracts. NRGI has done great research on contracts, disclosure issues, Oxfam and others. So I would think we need to set that issue aside once and for all. And I think in terms of the positive examples, a company like Cosmos Energy, who's in the room today, they've disclosed every single oil contract that they have. So clearly it's not an issue operationally for them around the world. And other companies like Tullow say it's their preference to disclose their agreements wherever they operate.
Okay. Back to the audience. Yes. 5 minutes. Okay.
Thanks. Laura Robinson from Swale House Partners. There's been a lot of discussion about accountability and data, but no discussion of the accounting industry or the accounting profession. And my question is about how you are leveraging the value of the accounting profession. There are accountants and an accounting practice and body in every country that has natural resources, but they are not leveraged generally, and we have one of the most unaccounted for industries on the planet in natural resources. And I'm curious how your organizations are bringing the two together.
Who wants to take that on? Sheila?
Well, did you say accounting profession, as in financial accounting? The whole shebang. Okay. No, I'm not sure I want to take this, but I'll take it. No, because I'm not sure of the context. What you're saying is, as we anticipate this initiative, what role do we envisage for this? Is that what you're saying? Yes. Okay. Okay, so, I mean, if I think about it, there's two legs. One is the disclosure. My sense is that a huge amount of the disclosure sits in the financial transaction as it does in the legal transaction space. So by definition, financial accountants are people that are able to audit financial transactions and break them down into, if you wish, pockets of transferable value will be very important in dissecting that information. And I think that for what we want to achieve when we say break it down so that it's user-friendly, That is a particular area where those professions can certainly have a hand because they have an understanding of what lies behind the data. The same applies to contract disclosure, the question that we have been talking about of what is proprietary. These people can be very helpful in breaking that down. But for me, to be sure, as I think about what we want to achieve today, a huge part of what I think we should try and address is, because there is so much to disclose, is there an argument for identifying pieces of data in the value chain, in the contract space, that really sit at the heart of citizen participation, and that maybe those are the ones we should focus on? If you give me, Citizen Sheila, the entire contract, are you really helpful? Or are there generic clauses there that warrant disclosure? Because if not known, they make the difference between human rights, citizen rights, ability to assess value, and to dialogue. My sense is that part of what we should do is this, because I fear that if we seek to disclose everything, all we're going to do is burden the very people we are trying to help with a lot of data, but data that is not necessarily useful. And certainly the fraternities about which you speak could be helpful in helping us determine where sits the real information, because otherwise it's just a lot of information, but not a lot of capacity to exercise judgment. My sense is that information to capacitate judgment is the key. And so if you link judgment with what is contained in the contract and the value of it, my sense is that we begin to get to where we want to get to, but not just disclosure for the sake of it. But that is just a view, and I hope we can discuss it this afternoon.
Did I see Debbie?
Can I respond to that?
It later. Ian.
Well, that kind of argument is what we heard from mining companies and oil companies over the last 15 years. And that's exactly the kind of argument that I think we need to avoid. I think these projects are public goods that are being monetized. And so let's try it out and see if we get crushed by data. I personally don't mind being crushed by data. And the idea that contracts shouldn't be out in the public domain, I don't think that's just a non-starter, as Danny said. And to go back to the question of the accounting firms, I think they are both problems and possible solutions to some of the questions that we're raising. So, for example, if the big four accounting firms are taking progressive policies and are advising their clients in terms of disclosure, that could be something very beneficial. If the International Accounting Standards Board adopts country-by-country reporting of taxes paid as a standard, and that the big four support that, that will go a long way in terms of avoiding tax base erosion and profit shifting. But on the other hand, we've seen accounting firms being involved in either facilitating corruption or being accessories to corruption. If you just look over the past week, the entire senior management of KPMG resigned in South Africa as a result of the Gupta leaks scandal. So I think there are pluses and minuses, but I do think, and I'm glad you raised the role of the accounting industry in this issue.
We have an urgent intervention here.
Yeah, very quickly again to complement that and to dovetail this issue of financial accountancy with something very concrete, and that's EITI again. And we should be looking at the local, at the national level, because with all these demand and requirements of producing this financial report, they need to be basically reconciled, and independent administrators and accountants do get involved there. So in our work, we need to link to that. And second, also related to risk management, look, we're all in the business, including our organization, of helping countries with financial and fiscal models. When there is a big oil field discovery and so on, what is the path of investments and revenues, and then the best way for revenue sharing later on, and so on. We need to incorporate much better these governance factors, including corruption, and the context in each country, because those scenarios are going to be very different. The typical fiscal models, and some very sophisticated from the IMF and so on, for a variety of reasons until now, they have not incorporated these risk management and risk factors. So that's in the next stage something that we economists and the financial profession needs to be working on, and I would look forward, possibly in the context of this project, that we look into those issues.
I'm afraid time's up. Panel, thank you, all of you, for your wonderful contributions, and thank you to the audience for being well engaged.